So today we're going to talk about the Nikon D700 and a little bit about its largest sibling, the D800 here. As you can see here, they're both very similar cameras. They're kind of out of the same stable. They've got very similar lenses on these two. One's a Sigma and one's a Nikon lens, but you know, that's really the only major difference between the two as they are set up here. But the Nikon D700, it might surprise you, is my kind of go-to camera. It's strange because I have a Nikon D800, which is a vastly superior camera as far as specs are concerned when you compare it to the D700, and it's also got much better facilities on board the camera than the D700's got. It's got better resolution. It's almost 40 megapixels, I think it's 36 megapixels or thereabouts, and the D700 is about 12 megapixels or 12.3, and that's a huge difference in cameras. But this is the camera I reach for most of the time, and that's even above the D800 and some of the Sony cameras that I've got, etc. And there's a really good reason for that. Now, it's not because I'm kind of a fanboy of the D700, it's not because that I'm jumping on the D700's bandwagon and saying that it's the only camera you'll ever need or the best camera you'll ever buy and so on. Well, it's kind of not. It's not the only camera you'll ever need, and it's probably not the best camera you'll ever buy, but it's not far off. It's a very, very competent and very good camera. Now, these are both full frame cameras. They're FX cameras as far as Nikon brands them. So they have a full frame sensor against the range of APS-C cameras, which are classed as their DX range of cameras. Now, you can change the lenses around on them because they have the same mount. So if you get a DX camera on Nikon with this same mount as these, then it doesn't really matter if you use a full frame lens on a DX camera or even use a DX lens on a full frame camera, because you can use both on either camera. The only thing you might lose is the ability to autofocus on some lenses, so you probably have to switch back to kind of manual focus on these. But that's kind of not what we're here for, although it's great that this range of cameras, FX and DX, have interchangeable lenses, so you can save you a lot of money if you get an APS-C Nikon, or you get an FX range full frame Nikon. So you know, there are advantages to having a same lens mount across the range. But most people will probably think, why don't you go for the 800 if you want to, you know, go and take some portraits or landscape shots and sport shots and so on, as opposed to the D700? Well, as you probably saw by my previous video, I did a shoot with a local singer on the D700, and the reason for that is because it has a certain color that's very hard to kind of get on different makes of cameras, especially, you know, even the D800 here. It doesn't have that kind of same color range. The software that's driving it isn't the same. You see, the D700 is built like a tank. It's a very nice camera to use. It's quite intuitive. It's fully manual, or just about fully manual really, when you compare it to the 610s and, you know, in the APS-C range and so on. But it's a camera that you can get along with very, very well. Everything that you see on this camera is what you get. You have a small LCD screen there, which you can change your settings from, you know, fully manual to aperture priority and so on. You've got two thumb wheels, one front, one back, which can be used for your shutter speed or your ISO, or again, you can reprogram the wheels and buttons on this to do what you want it to do. So whatever you're comfortable with, you can reprogram the way the buttons interact with the camera on here. But that's not all. can kind of be regarded as a fully professional camera, really, this one, even though it has a flash which tends not to get used very often, but it's a good little bounce or fill-in flash, so it does have its uses, and it can be used to fire off other flashes that you might have on a remote setting, etc. It can use manual or autofocus lenses, so you know you always have the choice, and on most of the lenses on these you can switch between manual, macro and autofocus, so you do have quite a good range of settings on the camera. But the camera itself is built like a tank. It's a camera that can take a lot of abuse. This one's done over 250,000 pictures and it's still fine. I'd have no problems in using this for absolutely anything. The only downside is that it only has one memory slot, where the 800 has two, but again there's two different cards that it uses, where it's not just a standard memory card that you kind of get now, an SD card and so on, but this camera only has the one. But if you're really worried about backing up your pictures and having that extra capacity, maybe the 800 is probably the camera to go for. But for me, this is my go-to camera, and there's a reason for that, apart from its build quality and its features. The 12 megapixel sensor on this is very, very good. It's pretty good in fairly low light conditions, and it's a very nice camera to use because of its sensor. It does let a lot of light kind of be absorbed by the sensor. I mean, it lets the same amount of light into the camera as any other camera, to be completely frank with you. It's not the fact that it lets in more light and so on. It's the sensor has bigger receptors on it, so basically it can actually use more light because they're bigger pixels that the actual sensor uses. So that's a good advantage, and especially in semi-poor light conditions. Although cameras have moved on since this was launched. I mean, this is a decade and a half old now, and in terms of technology, it's, you know, kind of shows its age a little bit. But when you actually take the pictures on this camera, you might think that 12 megapixels is going to be a little bit limiting. But if you have a look at this photograph here, you can see on the photograph itself on the screen it looks good. And most photos on a screen will look really good because you kind of down resolution them anyway to about 2 megapixels for the average computer monitor. We'll have a look at this picture of Marcus. It's quite a nice picture, but what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in to the photograph itself. Okay, so we're going to crop it heavily, much more than you would probably really ever need to crop, but it's just, you know, example of how good even 12 megapixels is on this camera. So now we're zooming in. You would expect a dramatic quality loss. You'd expect it to start to kind of pixelate at this point, but it's not. And you can see how close we're getting in. You can still see the outlines and the features and the freckles and so on the face of the subject very clearly. So as we zoom in a bit more and we crop deeper into the picture, you can see even with a very, very deep crop, the actual resolution still holds up. It's still something you could use for a photograph. And that's where people kind of get a little bit lost when they think about, oh, I need the best megapixel camera and so on and so forth. And here's another picture I took, and this is a picture of just a scene, a hideaway retreat kind of scene. And as you can see here, the colors are really good. I mean, this is unaltered, straight out of the camera, and just like the picture of Marcus, the colors are absolutely amazing. It's captured loads of different tonal ranges of the greens and the blues, and it really does stand out, and the color of the boat stands out against the rest of the picture. And again, this is a 12 megapixel camera, and this picture I have on a wall at A4 size, and it's really good. You wouldn't tell any difference between that and another picture from a camera with 2 to 3 times the actual resolution of this camera. Now, I've also got this picture blown up to twice A4, and it's still good. It's still very good quality. You wouldn't see any difference, and there's not really much point in actually showing it on a 2 megapixel monitor screen that you're actually looking at now. But you have to go massive for a 12 megapixel camera like this to start losing its edge, losing its quality. But then you're into the realms of you now need to step back to see the whole picture. So whatever quality that you're losing by printing out massive prints off a relatively small megapixel camera is kind of negated by the fact that you have to stand back, and your eyes can't tell any difference anyway. So really, from 99.9% of the uses you're ever going to put this camera to, this is enough in terms of megapixels for most people. There are occasions where maybe a 36 megapixel camera and so on, like the 800 here, will be an advantage, but you really do have to start cropping really deeply for that. Now, the other advantage of this camera is that when you take pictures on this camera and you put it on high shutter count, it is really, really quick. And as you can hear, I'll do that again. It's really quick, it's rapid, because the file sizes are smaller, and because of that the buffer can handle quite a few frames a second. And when you compare it to the 800 is not as good. It's slower. It buffers up a lot more rapidly because the file sizes are massive, unless you're dropping the resolution down on the camera, or maybe you're dropping it into a PSC mode, so basically DX mode. And that's the only way really you're going to keep up with this. So for kind of faster moving subjects, this is overall actually, in my opinion, a better camera than the 800, because you can just pan and shoot, and it's a lot better at it than this. Now, if you need the ultimate resolution and you need the dynamic range, well, the 800 is probably going to pinch it, because it does have a better dynamic range, and in RAW files or NEF files you can actually pull back a lot of that kind of detail that you may have missed. Whereas this one, it's a lot more difficult to pull the detail back. You can do it, but it's a little bit harder work. But what I tend to use this camera for is basically to take the picture and crop very little, or if any at all, because I like to have photographs that aren't cropped. So if you zoom in and you take the picture, it's done. That's it. You have the picture that you want. That's the plan with this. And because you can, or you can usually get the shot you want within a few shutter releases of this camera. So again, this has its advantages. And if we look at this picture here, just to give you an idea, it's again, it's of Rachel Hill, the local singer, and as you can see, the colours, the deep colours that this camera produces is just something you really don't get anywhere else. And when you do get a camera that can kind of mimic the colour that this camera can capture, it's still not quite there. So that's kind of subjective, I know, but it's, you know, it seems to be not just my opinion. There's an opinion of a lot of people who use this camera. So really, if we take a look at some of the pictures that I have taken with this camera, you can see how the range of colours and the images this camera produces are quite unique. This camera is good for portraits. You wouldn't think so, but some of the most iconic pictures that are out there from the time period of the launch of this camera through probably for the next decade are basically on a 12 megapixel camera like this, and if not the Nikon 700 or its stablemates. And these are really good at taking portraits, still life and so on. If you want to capture faster moving objects with a good lens on it, so you can get a little bit more reach, then this camera still produces very good results, and at very high ISOs as well, so you can knock the ISO up as well on this camera and get decent results. There are so many lenses out for this camera that you'll never be short of choice, really. You'll never be in a position where you can't find a lens to do what you want. I have about 4 lenses for this, and that's really all I found that I need for this camera, because if I want to do some really long range wildlife pictures and so on with a big lens, then I'm kind of use my Sony for that, because it's more set up for faster shutter speeds, capturing wildlife and so on, which this one, although it's good, it's more kind of useful for street photography, portraits, some wildlife photography, although as long as it's not really quick moving, really fast moving. If you want to capture birds in the sky and so on, maybe this might not be the camera for you, but it can do it. Sports, it's good at capturing sports, good at capturing cars, fast moving objects, people playing football and so on. This will do it very, very well. But you know, it does have its downsides, it does have its shortcomings, and one of them is the sheer weight of the camera. The camera is massively heavy. It's not one of these cameras you don't know you've got when you're carrying it around with you, and it's also not one of these cameras where you're just going to pull it out and take some shots and put it back in a little bag, because it's very bulky. You know you're carrying a camera when you've got this camera on you. But that's not much difference to most of the full-size FX or full-frame cameras. They're all pretty bulky when you're talking about DSLRs. The mirrorless full-frame cameras are smaller, but the ones I've used, I don't like the ergonomics of them, and that's another thing that one of these cameras is really good at, the ergonomics. Now, having quite large hands, this camera is really, really good, and with the extra camera grip on as well, it also makes it a very good camera for taking pictures on this angle or this angle, and it's very quick to kind of move around on the camera. It's, as I said, it's very ergonomic, especially for someone who needs to grip hold of the camera, and you will have to on this camera because it is quite heavy. Now, the other thing is you can put your hand underneath it for the lens, which gives it a bit more stability, but the grip alone actually allows you to have a fairly steady shot without too much support on the camera, which is not something that some of the more modern cameras, the mirrorless cameras, allow you to do, because the grips are tiny, the cameras are small, and there's nothing really to get hold of on some of these cameras to actually produce the shot that you want. And again, preference, but I still like a camera to look and feel and act like a proper camera. Doesn't do video, where the 800 also does video, but it's not brilliant at doing video. If you want a fully fledged camera, kind of video camera, there are better cameras on the market than these two, because these are predominantly photographic cameras, still picture photo cameras. They're not really geared up for video. The autofocus, even on the 800 on video, is not brilliant. Now, that leads me to the autofocus on this. The autofocus on this is very quick to react. It's actually a lot better than some of the more modern cameras, and because of the range of autofocus points that you have on this camera, it kind of gets away with just about every scenario that you might want to put this camera into. You can also manual focus as well, and it is very quick. The autofocus system is relatively quick, and it doesn't get mixed up between your focus point if you set it correctly on the back of your camera for what you want to do, either portrait, wide shots and so on. So again, for a camera that is as old as this technology wise, although there are a lot of newer cameras than the original first versions out there of the same model, but it's still based on 15-year-old or so technology, it's a very good performer. Now, would I go out, if I didn't have this camera, and buy one of these above maybe a more modern camera, or even an 800 or an 810 and so on? Well, I probably wouldn't if I'd never come across one of these before, because I'd think that these were maybe getting a little bit long in the tooth, a little bit on the old side. But now, having had the experience with a 700 prior to buying the 800, I wouldn't have gone for the 700 just because this is a newer camera. 3 times the resolution or more when you compare it to the 700, a slightly better autofocus system, a slightly lighter camera, but then the lenses do kind of make up for this slight difference in weight. The ergonomics are very similar with the grip, especially the extra battery grip and so on, and it feels like a very nice camera. It's got a bigger LCD screen and so on. The 800 and the 810 series would have been a camera that I would have gone for every day of the week. But because I have had that experience on the 700, I would probably, if given the choice between the two, and it was my only choice of camera, the only camera I could ever have, I'd be hard pushed not to go for this one, the 700, even though I really like the 800 and the 810 and so on. Mainly because it's versatile, and mainly because the file sizes are smaller, and mainly because the actual frames per second that it shoots doesn't ramp up and fill up the buffer as quick, and you can get more shots off on this camera. And also maybe because if you're in the field and you've got a laptop and you want to just do some quick editing on the pictures you've taken, the smaller file sizes make editing a breeze. It's a breath of fresh air when you compare it to the bigger file sizes on here. So quick, so convenient, so easy. And then when you're uploading them to social media or to a website and so on, they get scaled down anyway to around about 2 megapixels for maximum on some websites, but roughly about 2-ish megapixels. So the extra resolution is outweighed by what you're doing with the photographs. Now, if I wanted to print out something massive, I'd go for the 800 over the 700, only for being able to crop and then get bigger prints. But it's not very often you want really prints much bigger than A4, really, and most people don't. So in conclusion, if I'd never set eyes on a 700, I would have been more than happy with the 800. More than happy. It's a great camera. It's got many pluses over the 700 as well, which we'll cover maybe on another video. But if I was given a choice, as in for the only 2 cameras I had a choice of, I'd be hard pushed not to pick this, the 700. Even with all of its shortcomings, I actually really like this camera. So anyway, that's my kind of review or non-technical view of the 700. There's been lots of videos on the technical aspects of this camera, very few on the feel and what photographs it can actually produce and the quality and so on, and also covering its downsides. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you will come with me on a journey with these cameras a little bit more in the future, and I hope you'll subscribe and like. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.